All right, let's jump in here. So the purpose of this panel today is to talk about the power of open standards and what that means in the context of institutions starting to adopt Web3 standards. I want to provide just a brief example, and I'm going to start kicking it off to our panel of experts here. But one standard that I wanted to raise, because I think it'll bring some commonality to the group, especially those that are less familiar with Web3, is the standard of ISO 2022. It was a standard that solved a collective action problem across industry and across different areas of the markets that could bring everybody together and understand when a message is being sent, what it means. And that power really can help simplify things when everyone's operating off of the same rule book. And so our speakers today are all doing some form of standard setting within the Web3 space and outside the Web3 space to start bringing that same common language and that same ability to essentially solve a collective action problem. So we're going to start here with Dennis. Dennis is at 3643. Feel free to give a little introduction about yourself. And Dennis, how are you seeing standards operating for 3643?
Yeah, thank you, Taylor. It's a pleasure to be here. So a quick background about myself. As Taylor mentioned, I'm the president of ERC 3643, which is the largest RWA standard in the world. It's an official Ethereum standard and has been approved in over 23 jurisdiction regulations around the world, including recently with the SEC. I'm also CTO and partner of PSD Digital, a global asset management business, and I'm also a strategic advisor to DTCC. And to answer your question, Taylor, standards are exploding. We're seeing more and more standards come out of blockchain and start interacting with traditional finance standards, and we're just beginning to understand what all that means. So it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Great. And John, do you want to give a little bit of a background about yourself and explain how standards relate to OpenZeppelin's work?
Yeah, totally. So I'm John Neufeld. I lead legal and policy at a company called OpenZeppelin. We're an open source company, and we provide secure building blocks for anyone building decentralized applications to do so securely, easily, with modular design so that they can customize them. And yeah, we're seeing tremendous uptake from financial institutions with these building blocks that we created close to a decade ago. And it's really cool to see some of the largest institutions seeing kind of the security benefits and especially the interoperability benefits of using standard implementations that allow these financial Legos to be created and all kinds of new value to emerge on chain.
Awesome. Redwan, I wanted to ask you about Enterprise Ethereum Alliance and kind of how you're seeing standards adopted by your members, and just give a brief background on kind of what's happening over at the EEA.
Yeah, so the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance is an industry group representing Ethereum and promoting Ethereum to adoption for large enterprise and institution. And so a lot of the work that we do is maybe less on a technical level now, but more on a framework to facilitate and educate institution and organization for how they can implement Ethereum. Ethereum is becoming a general standard. We have the EVM, ERC-3643, we have also ERC-20. Those are names of different tokens and I think our role is really here to bridge the two worlds of Ethereum, best in class, with also the institution. And we do that through a lot of different events, bringing the conversation with people that sometimes don't talk to each other, and facilitating the understanding of how you can leverage Ethereum for your business and to make more money.
And Karen, last but not least, please tell me a little bit about what's going on at LFDT. I know it's an incredibly important organization in the establishment of standards for decentralized trust. You want to give me a little bit of background on yourself? And
yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So I lead the ecosystem and strategic initiatives at Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust. We are part of the Linux Foundation, which hosts open source code in a variety of technologies, but we focus in the decentralized space, hosting the communities, the developer communities, and the enterprises that are working to build on top of and collaborate on decentralized technologies. And we also, within our purview, focus on open standards. And what open standards means to us is standards that are developed in the open in a lightweight fashion that allows for multiple parties, whether it's government institutions, policy, the developers themselves, or the enterprises that are going to implement them, to collaborate together on what those standards can be, so that we can advance these technologies so that they're actually useful in the use cases we want to apply them.
That's a perfect segue, thank you. So I wanted to bring it now back down to earth a little bit for this audience and start talking about examples of how some of the institutions in the world specifically are starting to look at open standards in the Web3 space. And because each of you guys sit in different kind of verticals within, within the market and within your membership is very diverse. I want to hear a little bit about what kinds of implementations and examples you guys are seeing, each of you. And I think we'll just run down the panel the same way as before. So Dennis, is there an example you can think of maybe for 3643?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you know, DTCC is one of our flagship members, and they are totally transforming what it means to be a depository in this new regulatory environment. And ERC 3643 is part of that solution. And so we're seeing really interesting things happen with the NASDAQ filing around actual public securities. And certainly that's been really exciting. And then, of course, in Europe, we just received the permission from the WEPG in Germany and working with them to actually tokenize person funds that we had done with ABN AMRO. And even, of course, my firm, PSG, we're continuing to develop assets with Goldman Sachs, launching a large sustainability asset this year with it in the US. So a lot of work done on 3643, much more to come.
You gave me a lot to work from there, so I want to double click on a couple of these items. So maybe first for the audience, could you give a little bit of a background on what 3643 is as a standard and how it gets adopted?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So 3643 is a canonical token standard. So the same way we think about ERC20 for fungible, 721 for non-fungible, and all the different ones, 3643, believe it or not, is a final token standard. And what it attempts to do is what we call permission tokens. It's a special use case where the tokens need certain controls, certain identity, and certain rules to function. And these are to meet regulatory, compliance, or operational requirements. And they can be put across a variety of contexts. And we see a lot of advancements around permission tokens and infrastructure around permission tokens. But that's effectively what you would classify 3643. It's not meant to compete with ERC20. It has its own lane around on-chain permission.
Perfect. So kind of thinking about 3643, it's kind of the token standard upon which you can build your compliance obligations or you build your rules that you need to operate safely when you're in an on-chain environment.
Absolutely, and even with working with Chainlink, we've even taken it much further. 3643 not only has really penetrated the regulatory space just as control, but when you look at compliance and with integration into the automated compliance engine with Chainlink, it gives us a whole nother dimension of rule sets, which is incredible. Even in integration with Chainlink CRV, which gives us much more lively data around pricing and NAV, and even across on-chain ID, which we're seeing massive innovations on privacy. Is really moving standard forward. So standard is a living, breathing standard. We're seeing a lot of innovation around it while still keeping that core interface going. And that's very exciting to see. And that partnership with Chainlink has been tremendous for us.
Oh, that's awesome to hear. I want to continue moving on here. So John, now they've got a token. There's a token in the market someplace. Maybe it's using 3643 standard. Now it's going to start interacting with different on-chain systems. How does OpenZeppelin kind of come into play in your mind in terms of those standards and the things that you guys develop that are so important then when the token is actually out there and operating on chain?
Yeah, I think it's a big role we play is actually to review code when it's deployed, when it's upgraded, and to ensure, hey, does it meet these widely adopted standards like 3643 that enable interoperability and also tick all the boxes various counterparties and intermediaries and applications need to know that, hey, we're operating this application in accordance with our regulatory obligations, compliance obligations. And I think, what we want to ensure is that that's done securely and those standards are met and that folks, are able to easily diligence those counterparties and use things like automated monitoring tooling, NAV calculations, and they have out-of-the-box open source tooling to be able to automate along the chain and really realize the benefits of blockchain technology and increase the velocity of those assets and increase the assurance that, hey, this can fit within a vault that can automatically rebalance across protocols, earn yield in new ways, give me a better, or I would say maybe a more narrow spread on the risk-free rate or whatever it may be. And I think ensuring that interconnected web of financial applications all work seamlessly together and securely, and those assets are safe. You're getting those benefits, while ensuring that, hey, I can ultimately bring back my asset. I don't totally lose custody over it. I know where it is at all times. It's visible, transparent on chain.
Oh, no, that's great. And I think one of the pieces that you clicked on, you mentioned there is just the open nature of a lot of this. So many of these smart contracts are living on public blockchains where the code is transparent to users of the platforms and is also something that where it is formally verified and you can actually look at the code itself. How do you see, just as a bit of a follow-up for you, John,
Sure.
How do you see the importance of that open nature of the code often on these public blockchains playing into the security model?
Yeah, I think transparency is huge, and I think often people think, oh, open source code or source public code, red flag. I'm a lawyer, so often that's the initial reaction when folks think about open source. But it's kind of counterintuitive, but we've seen institutions actually prefer open source in many cases because the cool thing about it being out there in the open is there are thousands of developers building with it, tinkering with it, some with good intentions, some with bad intentions trying to break it. But after a decade, if it hasn't been broken, it actually has potentially greater security guarantees than novel closed source code that only a handful of folks have looked at, right? And so over time, I think blockchain is emerging as arguably a more secure platform in that regard. And the interesting thing about open source is anyone can pick that up and use it based on the terms of its license. It's not like SaaS where folks here might know what a procurement process in an enterprise or a regulated institution is like. That's months long. You have to have a really strong use case, whereas open source, you see it out on chain, you can take it and start building with it. So I think it actually allows people speed to market as well.
That's great, thanks. Redwan, I wanted to ask you a little bit. Before we came up on stage, you mentioned that there's a tremendous amount of collective action problems being solved for the L2s in the Ethereum ecosystem. I'd love to hear a little bit more as we kind of zoom out. We've gone from the token, we've gone to the smart contracts it's interacting with, and maybe now we'll go to the blockchain itself. What are you seeing at EEA, and how are those groups working together to establish common ground?
So one of the new members that we have this year, in addition to having ERC-3643, Chainlink also, LFDT, and some others, is L2Bit, for instance. Like L2Bit has been like a really tremendous partner to help formalizing what it is to be actually part of the Ethereum ecosystem and what it means and how to translate that technically. Part of the work that we do now is really translating that very technical work into language that can be understandable by enterprise and institution. And so we do that by really engaging with different either rating agencies or people doing some work in that space to transform the language. A lot of the work that we do is really on I would say not on a technical level, but make sure we have those different technical standards being part of our organization, so we know where they are and we can talk about them. But really helping having some language that can support the understanding of the institution. Part of also the work that we do is, for instance, working with our members to explain what are the privacy solutions that they have, from what framework and how you can implement those. Because one of the advantage but pitfall of the Ethereum ecosystem is that we're very engineering focused. And so sometimes it can make this a little bit difficult to get into and to understand, because explaining the power of a KZG commitment to someone doing some digital asset trading is a little bit of a far-fetched, even for me, I'm not a cryptography expert. And there is some of those primitives sometimes that are so complex and very almost counterintuitive, because the cryptography can achieve things that are almost magical. We say when you cannot explain the science, it can look magical. And that's how I feel sometimes. Oh, okay, so it's working. So that's the type of work that we do, and really supporting, for instance, in the L2, there is a huge working group on the Ethereum ecosystem, about 700 members. And all the different L2, there is about 162, 160-ish L2s right now. And they're all collaborating in an open source format on, I think, a monthly basis, where they actually work on some faster finality, faster withdrawal. And so behind those terms is saying, hey, how my transactions confirm faster, how I can also have access to liquidity faster. And those are things that are being addressed and built as we speak. And it's pretty incredible to witness the Ethereum community coming together to build those technical blocks, with now the context is going to really unleash an incredible power for Ethereum.
Awesome. All right, Karen, I've got one for you too. And this is, I think, building again off of what we just talked about. We have the chains And now we're going towards even a broader group, which is now talking about all of the various different types of applications and finding standards for those applications that can start to be stretched across, every single ecosystem, whether it's Ethereum or Solana or many of the other blockchains, permissioned or public. What are some of the things you're seeing on the application side that industry is adopting, and how are standards playing into those?
Yeah, I think one distinction that I want to point out about the code that we host and the standards that we host as well is that it's we are a neutral foundation, and so what I think institutions are really looking for is they're looking for trust at scale, and they're looking for frameworks that are open, auditable, and interoperable. And an open standard framework that's hosted at a neutral foundation allows for that trust to develop, because you have you're avoiding the vendor lock-in. You've got very open licensing, like Redwan just mentioned, and so that really allows a standard to reach network effects. I think what we all might like to see is something akin to the TCP/IP framework of the internet. Why did that become such a foundational element of the internet? And it's because it was something that was very open, allowed others to participate. It was very implementable, and allowed for those. Then, when it was adopted, allowed for many different applications to develop. And so, some of the standards that we see happening with that model in mind, that we see institutions using and adopting, are the Trust over IP framework, which is a layered architecture for verifiable credentials and trusted data to move freely across jurisdictions and sectors. And so there's regulators involved in that project that we host. There's many different financial institutions who are looking at implementing verifiable credentials. We also host a project called Hyperledger and Non-Creds that's been used widely in the credentialing space as well, in particular with the government of British Columbia and Canada, in order to credential their different company licenses for, like, for example, registration for a company, or for licensing a business to sell alcohol, for example. All that's been credentialed using a non-creds, and they've been heavily involved in that process. So I think when we will see more of these applications because of the network effects of an open collaborative environment.
Totally. I wanted to ask also just about an application specifically that I'm kind of close to my heart, which is Hyperledger Besu, which I think has now changed its name a bit. But
it's just Besu.
Besu now.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear a little bit about how Besu plays into that same open standard model and kind of its adoption with industry, because I think that would be useful for the group.
Yeah, absolutely. So Besu is a distributed ledger technology that was developed within Consensus, and in 2019 was contributed to the Linux Foundation and is now an open source project that we host, and that and follows along with our open governance principles. So anyone who follows along the path can become a maintainer, not just the original maintainers of that project. And so that's what allows for the decentralized aspect of how that code continues to develop. And Besu has been widely adopted in the financial space for a lot of the institutions that you see doing tokenized securities, tokenized bonds, some digital currencies. The Brazil Drex project is built on Besu. The DTCC app chain is built on Besu. So is Citi Token Services, HSBC's token solution as well. And so that's an example of where It's not a, Besu is a code project. It's a DLT that is an important part of the Ethereum community. It actually services about 16-17% of Ethereum mainnet as a client. So it's not a standards effort per se, like Trust over IP is, but it's an example of how when you have something that's built in an open community in a neutral home with that sort of open licensing, we do Apache licensing at the Linux Foundation, that it can become a default standard just purely by the fact that it's being widely used and adopted due to those characteristics of the code project. So there are many ways that standards get developed, both formally and informally, I guess.
Awesome,
Yeah.
thanks. Okay, I wanted to throw this one up to the group a little bit more. This is a kind of a question for you to prognosticate about what you see is happening in the future with respect to these standards and how they are adopted by industry. And just to put a little bit of color on this, I think many are seeing that the world is becoming more and more fragmented within the blockchain space. There seems to be a new L1 and a new stablecoin that's being announced every day on their own chain. How do you see that trend playing into the need for open standards, or perhaps countering some of these open standards? And happy to have whoever's interested in jumping in first.
Yeah, I'll jump in first. So I think as an industry, we're shifting more and more to dealing with fragmentation and dealing with lack of standards. And so the problem has always been, well, you have many different permission token standards or vault standards or whatever, and all of them are good, but which one does everyone agree on? And that becomes an unsolvable problem. And so for us at the ERC 3643, one of our biggest problems with fragmentation is our lack of access to DeFi, being able to provide great collateral venues and facilities for that. And I'm actually happy to do a little bit of a tease here that my company PSG and with ERC 3643 and some of our partners here will be helping to solve that by bringing permission tokens into DeFi. But the key part is to make it easy for the regulators and to do it in a standards-first, open-source way. And I think it's something that Karen and John touched on earlier, is open source is sort of expected, neutrality is expected, but I think to make life easier for regulators, especially around activities around interoperability, lending, other activities beyond smart contracts, we're seeing a bigger push for the industry to come together, for co-opetition partners to come together and say, this is the standard that we want to push. We think this is the best means to do so, and this is a way that everyone can do this activity under a certain regulated activity, and that gives the regulators the ability to say, okay, we want to push this forward, industry forward. You're making it easier for us to come around standard, and from a practicality matter, say this is actually one of the ways you could do it. And then, of course, by open sourcing it, then everyone can build their own version or own twist on it and still continue to contribute innovation. But the fragmentation is very real for 3643. It's real for other activities we do in the industry. And so the encouragement that 3643 is taking is we're more focused on, as Karen says, open standards, sourcing open standards from communities and helping different standards, even standards that might be considered almost competitive to the ERC 3643, help and achieve final status so they could actually come to market. That's a key tenet for us at ERC 3643 and for our partners, is that openness and fair play to the market.
So what I'm hearing a little bit there is you think that in some ways it is who's first and who's able to solve the problem maybe most conclusively can be the standard that starts to be adopted most broadly. Does anybody else want to respond to that? I'd be interested. Yeah, Redwan?
Yes, sorry. Just, you mentioned fragmentation, and fragmentation is definitely like a situation, that we have even within the Ethereum ecosystem. But I would balance a little bit this as, it's fragmented, but it's also extremely interoperable, extremely like those interoperable working group, like you can really move from one L2 to another one within an instant. And they've done an incredible work to really build, and it's also kudos to the Ethereum Foundation has been stewarding that work to really make the platform Ethereum feeling like a unique, almost like an app. And they're making more effort into this. They released some new RFPs when they want to really push more that vision, meaning you can have something on Arbitrum and something on Polygon and something on Zik, I think, and they can really communicate and have access to all that ecosystem and liquidity in one instant. And I think that's what is going to really unlock. When you talk about all those different L1 popping up every day, I think it's part of a natural, it's actually a good thing because it's mean like people, sometimes you need to go and build your own thing to really get the grasp of what it means. And when they want to become a L2 on Ethereum, we have some tools and things to be done. And that's it for my little chill of the Ethereum ecosystem. But I think, yeah, it's pretty positive.
They need to find community eventually, is I think what I'm hearing. They'll go out there, they'll go and find their own way for a little while, and then they'll realize that there's some other people around who might be able to help. You want to add something?
Yeah, I think that there's been a lot of fragmentation since the beginning because it's just been this Cambrian explosion of innovation, and that is a good thing. And I think maybe there's all along the way as we continue along this sort of Web3 evolution, we're going to probably have little Cambrian explosions that fragment different aspects of the space, right? And then we come together. I think now that especially what I see is more of a desire to the come together part. And I think, the fact that more regulated entities are starting to get into this space, it's kind of a forcing function because they just can't entertain all these different options, and I think are going to force the ecosystem to collaborate where it makes sense, stop reinventing the wheel, and compete where you actually differentiate,
Yes.
and collaborate on creating foundations and frameworks that allows us to actually involve these institutions in this space. And so I think we're getting there, we're moving towards that. So I think it's a positive, and I'm looking forward to it.
Great. John, do you want to add anything on this question? Otherwise, I can throw out another one.
I think I lost sight of the original question.
The original question is just, in a world that seems to be fragmenting,
Yeah.
how are you seeing that fragmentation play out vis-a-vis open standards? To the extent that maybe at OpenZeppelin, you're seeing more institutions adopting those standards, but still trying to do it kind of within their own silos or within their own lanes.
Yeah, I think I'm encouraged. I want to mention one thing which Karen said earlier before our panel, which really resonated with me, is maybe breaking out the terminology, not just saying standards when any time we create a framework, and maybe frameworks is a first step, and standards is some more formal, like adopted kind of stage, because I think a common scenario is in technology, oh, there's 14 standards, none of them talk to each other. I'm going to create a new standard to capture them all, and now we have 15 standards. And I think like OpenZeppelin's role in this, like we're open source, but we're almost biased, and we look at all the standards out there and go, what do people really need, and what are they actually using? And we're actually going to create the most minimal design and break these into the most minimal composable building blocks as possible with security in mind, reliability in mind, for kind of the more institutional adoption use case. And that's our approach, right? And I mean, we've looked, and like last week, the top 10 RWAs by market cap are, using our smart contract implementations. 8 out of 10 stablecoins by market cap, same thing. So, we see people gravitating towards these implementations of standards, right? We didn't necessarily draft the ERC or the EIP proposal in every case, but we're seeing folks pick up, hey, yeah, I can trust this, and then I see my peers doing it, and the industry then can kind of adopt that. So, I think
You put the building blocks out there, and you let them compose them together, and then over time,
Modularity is key.
yeah, that standard starts to develop.
yeah, and I think it's imperative that folks do gravitate around standards or something, whatever we want to call it, because I think the success case of finance on chain only works if this stuff does all interoperate, is compatible with each other, right? Unless we're creating net new value on chain. I mean, we all know you put an asset on chain, it doesn't intrinsically become more valuable, right? You need to create something new, or you need to be able to, lower costs. And so I think, yeah, it's imperative that all these folks, institutions, industry, regulators are all talking and interacting and figuring out how to come up with these common frameworks.
Excellent. So I think we're at time. Thank you guys so much. This has been wonderful.
Thank you.
Take a photo?
Thank you.
Yeah.